I want to be sure to do at least one example that demonstrates how this pivoting procedure works in the simplex method. We're solving our linear programs by using technology, but there may be some time in your future where you actually are required to, or at least see how the pivot process works. In this problem, a little small here, but we can read it. It says, suppose a furniture manufacturer makes chairs, sofa, and tables. Consider the following chart of labor hours required and available. All right, so let's just get an idea of what's happening. So for chairs, we got 6 hours of carpentry required. For sofas, 3 hours of carpentry. For tables, 8 hours of carpentry. And altogether, there's 784 daily hours of labor available. And so on for finishing and upholstery. And then we're given this. The profit for a chair is $70, $50 for a sofa, $100 for a table. So how many pieces of each type of furniture should be manufactured each day to maximize the profit? We'll start as we usually do by introducing some variables. So let X, that'll be the number of chairs that we manufacture each day. Y will be the number of sofas, and Z will be the number of tables. Now we're also going to introduce our slack variable. So what we'll do here is we'll let U equal the number of unused labor hours for carpentry, right? We have 784 available. Doesn't mean we have to use all of them. There may be some that are unused. And then we'll let V be the number of unused hours that go for finishing, and W the number of unused hours for labor for upholstery. Now we can almost get our linear program right from what we're given right here. Let's just go down the columns. I mean, it's almost set up for us here. So we're going to have, for chairs, for labor, we're going to have 6, 1, 4. And what was the profit on a chair? 70. For sofas, reading down that column, is 3, 1, 4. And the profit on a sofa, $50. Let me make that a 50. And for tables, it was 8, 2, 0, and $120 on tables. And what we have available for carpentry, that's going to be less than or equal to 784. For finishing, that's going to be less than 152. And for upholstery, that's going to be less than or equal to 400. So our linear program is going to look like this. Maximize P equals 70x plus 50y plus 120z, subject to our constraints. And the first one is, we can just read right across that first row, 6x plus 3y plus 8z is less than or equal to 784. And then the second row is x plus y plus 2z, that's going to be less than 152. And the third row, 4x plus 4y plus 0z, that's going to be less than or equal to 400. And of course, our non-negativity constraints, x has to be greater than 0, y has to be greater than or equal to 0, as does z. So there's our linear program right here. Now we could solve this problem using technology, but I want to show you at least once the pivoting process that goes with this simplex method. You may see it in the future, you won't see it in this course, but sometime in the future you could see it or be required to use it. So we'll start by setting up our initial tableau. So we'll have a column for each one of the variables, x, y, z, and then our slack variables, u, v, w, and our profit function, p. And let's get this first row in. So the first row we're going to have what? For our numbers down here. 6, 3, and 8, right? We have 6 x's. I'll just write them in as I say them. We have 6 x's, 3 y's, 8 z's. Now what is u? U, remember, was the number of unused hours for carpentry. And that's what this first row is. This first row was for carpentry. So we have 1 U. Now we have no V's and no W's, because what was V and W? V, that was the number of unused hours for finishing. And this first row here has just to do with carpentry. The second row is finishing. The third row is upholstery. So we have no unused hours here for finishing and no unused hours for upholstery, and there's no profit function in this first row here. So that's going to be a 0 also. And in the very last, we're going to have 784. Now remember, up here it used to be less than or equal to 74, but now here's the less than, but we added in the unused amount, so that brought us up to exactly 784. Let's write in the second row. So it's going to be, our second row is coming from finishing, so that's going to be 1, 1, 2. Now this is finishing. U was the number of unused hours for carpentry. There's no carpentry in this one. This is just finishing. But there is 1V here, the number of unused hours for finishing. There's no W. That was the number of unused hours for upholstery. There's no profit. And adding in that V takes us right up to exactly 152. Then for the last row here, this is for upholstery. We're going to have 4, 4. Now I'm going to put in the 0. Now there's no labor involved in, this is unused hours for labor for carpentry, because we have no carpentry in this one, right? This is just upholstery. There's no unused hours here for finishing, but there is one for upholstery. There's no profit in this one, and that will bring us exactly up to 400. So we have one more row here. Let's finish it off, and that's going to come from our profit function, our objective function up here. Now notice how we've written these constraints are written with the x, y, z's, the variables on the left side and the constant on the right. This objective function has variables on both sides. So let's get all the variables on, say, the left side to match this. So I'll subtract the 70, subtract the 50, subtract the 120. So what I'm looking at here is this. I'm just going to rewrite this as negative 70x minus 50y minus 120z plus p equals 0. And then I can put these numbers, these coefficients, down here at the bottom. So it's going to be negative 70, negative 50, negative 120. Now there's no u's here, right? U is the number of unused hours for carpentry, and this is a profit function. There's no v's, there's no w's, but there is one profit. And right now, the way this is set up is that, what do we have on this side is a 0. Now, I'm going to read what we have here as far as values for x, y, z, u, v, w, and p, but then I'm going to erase them. Do you remember what we said about the x's, or the x, for any variable? If you look at the column and if it has a 1 in all zeros, we're going to be able to get a value from over here. But if you have no 1, well, if you don't have a 1 in all zeros, like this case, there is no 1 in all zeros. So the only way the system can be consistent is for x to be 0. So right now we're saying x is 0. Similarly, in the y column, there's no 1 in all zeros. So y has to be 0. And the z column, you do not have a 1 in all zeros. So in this case, z has to be 0. And what about u, v, and w? Well, look what happens here. There's a 1 in this column, 1 in all zeros. So u is 784. Same thing with v. There's a 1 and all zeros in that column, so v is the 152. And in the w column, there's a 1 in all zeros, so the w is the 400. And then you also have the p column. In the p column, you have a 1 in all zeros, and p is equal to 0. And here's what this all means. We haven't made anything yet. We're just starting out. So how many chairs have we made? 0. How many sofas? 0. How many tables? 0. How many hours do we have left for carpentry? All of them. Same thing with finishing, same thing with upholstery, and our profit here is 0 because we haven't made anything yet. So our plan is to use pivoting and row operations to get from this initial tableau to the final tableau, from which we can read the solution to our linear program. That is, find the values of x, y, z that maximize our profit function. Now, when you look down to this last row where that profit function is, You see, this is the most, I'm going to call it the most negative number. I'm down here at negative 120. It's like to the left of these numbers here. So this I'm going to call the most negative number. That's where I want to start. So what I have to do is I have to pick my pivot element. Now the pivot element is going to occur in this column. So to get the pivot element, two things you have to do. First of all, get the column and then the row. Now to get the column, pick the most negative of those numbers, right there. Now to get the row, you're going to make divisions. You're going to take this number over here, I'm over to the right now, take this number and divide it by the corresponding number in the column. So this is going to be 784 divided by 8. So I'll write that here. This is going to be 784 divided by 8, which comes out to be 98. Now the next one is the 152 divided by its corresponding number in that pivot column, which is 2. So this is going to be 152 divided by 2. We get a 76 there. And the last one here is that 400 divided by 0. Now, we don't make any divisions by 0 or negative numbers. If any of these numbers here is 0 or negative, we just don't bother with the division, right? So I'm not even going to bother with this one. So I would take that out. Now, look for the minimum. What is the smallest of these quotients? Well, that would be this one right here, right? That's going to be this 76. That is the minimum. So that tells me which of the rows I'm going to use. So my pivot element is going to be in this column here, the Z column, and in the minimum row. So my pivot column is right there. It's going to be the 2. So that's going to be the pivot right there. Now I know how these pivots work. What I want is a 1 in that position. So I'm going to have to change row 2. So I can get a 1 in that position if I take the current row 2, divide it by 2. So divide everything by 2. Now, that's easy enough. I don't need to write it down here. I'm just going to write the new tableau, and I'll write it right next to this one. So let's rewrite this entire tableau, but I am going to divide through row 2 by 2. So let's do this. So dividing every one of these numbers in row 2 by 2, we are going to get 1/2, 1/2, 1. Right, there's our pivot. 0 divided by 2 is 0, 1/2, 0, 0, and that 152 divided by 1/2, right, that was our minimum, and that was 76. Now we're just going to do our regular pivot operation. So what I'm going to try to do now is get a 0 here with row 2 and row 1, and then row 2 and row 3 to get a 0 here. So let's start this process up on the top right here. I'm going to use row 2 and then get a 0 here. So I know how this works. I take the opposite of that number, right? Remember that? So you get, here's how we'll write this. Row 1 is going to get replaced with negative 8 times row 1 plus our pivot row, row 2. And that's going to look like this. So take that negative 8, multiply it through every one of these numbers here in row 2. So we'll get negative 8 times 1/2, well that's going to be a negative 4 again, and then negative 8 times 1 is negative 8, and then a 0, and a negative 4 again, 2 zeros, and negative 8 times 76 is negative 608. I will circle that, and then in just a bit we will add that to row 1. Now let's use the pivot row in row 3 to get a 0 here. So the opposite of this number, positive 120. So we'll take a positive 120, multiply it through that pivot row. So row, I guess that's row 4 now. Row 4 becomes positive 120 times row 2 plus row 4. And take that 120, multiply it through every one of those numbers here in row 2. So 120 times 1/2. There's a 60, another 60, a 120, a 0, another 60, and 2 more zeros, and I got a 9120 when I made that multiplication. So let's circle that, and then we will add that to row 4, and we'll get our next tableau. So let's write our next tableau. I'll do that here. You know, I think I'll get rid of some lines there. I need that room. I know where it goes. So here's what we're going to have. I'll just write it here. Now, the current row 1 right here is going to get added to this row 1 up here. So what are we going to get here? Negative 4 and 6 is a 2. Then we're at negative 4 and 3 is a negative 1. Then we're at negative 8 and 8, that's the 0 we were looking for. Then we have a 0 and a 1, all right, that's a 1. Get it to right here, 1. And then for our V column, we'll have a negative 4 and a 0, so there's a negative 4. For the W column, I got a 0 and a 0, so there's a 0 here. 0 for the P column, right? I'm right here. 0 and 0 is 0. And then what do we get out here at the end? Now we're going to get negative 608 plus 784. That is a 176. Now, second row stays the same. I just wrote it in there. Third row stays the same. I'll just write that in. So I just wrote in that third row, right? No change to the second and third row. I just wrote those in. So now let's draw a line and we'll change that fourth row. So our fourth row is going to become the original fourth row down here added to this one. All right, so now what do we get here? First and first, 60 and add to negative 70, we get a negative 10. Then a 60 minus 50 is positive 10. Then the 120 minus 120 is a 0. And then, where are we here? A 0 and a 0 is 0. And then we're at 60. And a 0 is 60. Keep all these things in order here. And then I think we're here at that 0. And that 0, that's a 0. And then for P, we're at this one right here. Right, we're at that one, 0. And a 1 is a 1. And then what do we have here? Finally, we got 9120. 9120, oh, that's a mess. 9120 and 0, 9120. Now let's just look at this tableau and see where we are. Let's read this off. Now, in the X column, I do not have a 1 in all zeros, so right now X has to be 0. So I'm going to erase this in a minute here, but right now X is 0. What about Y? Y, I do not have a 1 in all zeros, so Y has to be 0. What about Z? Well, Z, I have a 1 in all zeros, so right now Z is 76, so I can write that, 76. And let's go ahead and get the others, U, V, W, and P. So what do you know about U? Well, you have a 1 and all zeros, so U is equal to 176. Now look at the V column. V, you do not have a 1 in all zeros, so V has to be 0. But what about the W column? You have a 1 and all zeros, so W is equal to 400. And the P column, we've got a 1 and all zeros, so the P column is 9120. So P is 9120. Here's the information we have so far. So if we make that first pivot, here's where we are. If we sell, or if we make, I guess, if we manufacture Right, if X is 0 and Y is 0. So we manufacture no chairs, no sofas, but we manufacture 76 sofas. Here's what would happen. We would have 176 hours of carpentry still remaining, no hours for finishing, and 400 hours for upholstery still remaining, and our profit would be $9,120. But we can still do better. And how do we know? Because we still have a negative number in that bottom row. So as long as you have negative numbers in that bottom row, you can keep going. You can still keep pivoting. So the next row, the next column would be what? You look in that bottom column, bottom row, the most negative, and in fact the only negative is that 10 right there. So I have the pivot column. Now I need to determine the pivot row, and we do it like this, just like we did the other one. I look at this number over here, the constant, and I divide it by the corresponding number in the pivot column, as long as it's not 0 or negative. I don't divide by zeros or negative numbers. So in this case, we're going to have, all right, I'll write it here. It's going to be that 176 divided by 2. Right, that gives me an 88. Then I'm going to take this 76, divide it by a 1/2. Right, now that's just like multiplying by 2, but I'll write it out. All right, so 76 divided by half, that's equal to 76 times 2, which is 152. And now, divide the 400 by the element in the pivot column, which is 4. So I'm going to get 400 divided by 4, which is 100. And now I look for the minimum value. And there it is right there, right? That is the minimum. That is the smallest value. So that tells me to use this element right here as the pivot element. So that's our pivot right there. So we know how this goes. Now we're not going to do it this time. You know how to pivot. What do? You turn this into a 1. So what would you write here? I'll just write this, right? So row 1 is going to become the current row 1 divided by 2. That gets you a 1. Then you use that 1 with row 2, get a 0, row 3, get a 0, row 4, and get a 0. That'll give you your next tableau. So you know how to do that, so I'm not going to do all that here. There's just one more. So I'm not going to go through all that again. You know how to do it. I'm just going to write the final tableau. And this is going to be the final tableau because the next time I do this, right, when I go through that row operation business again, here, here, and here, I will have no negative numbers in the bottom row. So I'll be at the final tableau, and here's what it is. So if you did it, you can check with mine. If not, you can just trust me on this one. So what have we got here? I have no negative numbers in the bottom row, so I know I'm done. This is the final tableau, and now from this tableau I can read the solutions to my linear program. So let's get the values for x, y, z, u, v, and w. So what do we get for x? Well, I've got a 1 and all 0, so I can read this. X is 88. Now what was x? X is the number of chairs that we were going to build. So we're going to maximize our profit if we build 88 chairs. What about y? Y, I do not have a 1 and all 0, so the only way the system can be consistent is for y to be 0, so we're not going to build any sofas. And what about z? Z, well, I got a 1 and all 0, so follow it over. Z is 32, so we're going to build 32 sofas. No, tables, right? 32 tables. Let's just go over and get each one of these. So what about u? Well, look at u. U is, there's no 1 and all 0, so u has to be 0. And u was the number of unused hours for carpenters. We've used up all the carpentry hours. What about v? V was the number of unused hours for finishing. We used up all the finishing hours, so we have none of those left. And then what about w? W was the number of unused hours for upholstery. And it looks like we have a 1 and all 0, so that's going to be a 48. So we have 48 remaining hours for upholstery that maybe we could allocate elsewhere. And then what's our product? What's our profit here? Well, the P column, I got a 1 and all 0, so the profit is $10,000. We can write this conclusion. Profit is maximum at what, $10,000 when we make, all right, so what have we got here? 88 chairs, 0 sofas, and 32 tables. There we go.